Do you find it difficult to capture sharp wildlife photos in low light? After doing this for 18 years, I can tell you this is where most images fall apart. I've missed my fair share of shots in low light, but the truth is, low light photography is much easier once you understand what's actually happening. In this video, I'll show you the techniques I used to capture these 3 clean wildlife images when the light was low. There is a lot to unpack in this one, so stick around. Let's start with this first image of a leopard captured using a spotlight. Now, the image was shot at ISO 4000. So you can see here, the image isn't exactly perfectly sharp. Now, this was shot with an old camera back in 2011, and back then I was unsure of how to use ISO to its full potential. And I lost this image in the process because it's not perfectly sharp. Now, we all know that the higher your ISO is, the more noise gets introduced into your image. Now, noise is not created by an ISO. Noise is actually created by the lack of light hitting the sensor. So when your ISO is very high, there's a little bit of light being captured by the sensor, and ISO is adding amplification to that signal, thereby bringing out the visibility of all of that noise. So if you want to counteract the amounts of noise in your image, you need to expose as brightly as you can. Now, noise will cause a lot of grain in your image. The fidelity of colors will be impacted, details in your image will be lost, and also the dynamic range that the sensor can capture will become lower. So the most important thing to combat noise is to feed the sensor as much light as possible. Now, at nighttime, it's obviously incredibly difficult to do that. So how do we add light onto the sensor? We either slow down the shutter speed, we open up the aperture as wide as possible, or we add in more light. So looking at this image, we have faltered here because our shutter speed was not fast enough. I'm already shooting at f4, my ISO is at 4000 and 1/200th of a second. How do we increase that sharpness? We just add more shutter speed. We need to evaluate the subject in the frame, and we need to come up with a strict shutter speed threshold that we need to try and use to capture a sharp image. So if this leopard was completely still and my lens was completely still, 1/200th of a second would be fine. But because the leopard is moving, 1/200th of a second is not fast enough. So in this example, I should have at least increased my ISO to 8000. That would have allowed me to use 1/400th of a second, and hopefully that would have rendered a sharp image. Now, going back to how you add more light to an image. My aperture was wide open. That's what I highly recommend for low light photography. My ISO needs to be as high as what it needs to be. I normally set ISO 25600 as my maximum because remember, a sharp, noisy image is a lot better than a blurry, clean one. You can always remove the noise afterwards. You can't bring back an image like this one, for example, which is slightly soft. Let's have a quick look at the edited file. Here you can see I've tried to sharpen the face of this leopard a little bit, and I think for social media or a small print it will work, but it's not ideal. Shooting in RAW gives you the most flexibility to recover tones when you're working on the edge of the available light. And this is also where your editing can really elevate a photograph. In my Lightroom photo editing course, I share my trusted workflow and techniques I've developed to turn challenging low light files into powerful, natural looking images. If you want to improve your editing and get more out of your photographs, the course is linked below. Let's move on to this next image of a lion in very low morning light. Now you can see this was shot at 1/15th of a second, ISO 1800. Now, going back to our shutter speed chat about the leopard, 1/200th of a second was not fast enough. But if I evaluate this photograph of the lion, 1/15th of a second is incredibly slow. And I'll tell you the reason why I use that in a moment. When I arrived at the scene, the lion was sitting there, I was in my own vehicle, and my lens was stable. Now, it's important when you are shooting low light to make sure that your camera is as stable as possible. I don't advise hand holding your lens and camera at all when it's low light. I always use a beanbag in my vehicle, or if you're outside of a vehicle, use a tripod or brace the lens against something just to keep it as low or as stable as possible, I should say. Remember, in low light, any camera shake is also going to increase the chance of the image being blurry or soft. So there are 2 factors which cause the blurriness, which is obviously the lens moving and the subject moving. So in this example, my lens was perfectly still and the lion was perfectly still. So I started out probably with about 1/200th of a second. I captured the image, I knew, okay, I've got a sharp shot. Now, what I'm going to do here, I call this almost shutter gambling. I like to shoot an image, decrease the shutter speed to get a slightly better ISO speed, take another photograph. If the line stays still and my camera is still, my chances of capturing a sharp shot at 1/100th of a second increase. Now, I went all the way down to 1/15th of a second. At ISO 1800, it was way better than the image captured at 1/200th of a second at ISO 10,000. So if you have a very cooperative subject like this line was, he was sitting here and he was not moving. That's when I advise, get a sharp photograph and gamble with that shutter speed. Drop it lower and lower and lower. But just keep one thing in mind. If this line were to get up and I was shooting at 1/15th of a second, there is no chance I would have captured a sharp photograph of this line at 1/15th if he was moving. So in this example, how I set my camera up is I put it on auto ISO. Now, that way I don't have to worry about the ISO speed. I set my aperture as wide as possible to let in the most amounts of light I can. On this lens, it was the Nikon 180 to 600. So at 600 millimeters, the widest aperture I have is at f6.3. So that was locked in. I did not change that. Then the only thing I thought about during the sighting was shutter speed. Was the line resting? Was the line moving? And I judged the shutter speed needed accordingly. So when you are shooting very slow shutter speeds, gambling with the shutter, just remember the line can get up, and in that case, you need to immediately move that shutter speed faster to capture a sharp shot. Now, had this line got up, I would have immediately put my shutter speed to at least 1/400th of a second. I would say that's the limit or the slowest you can go for a moving subject. And in this example, the line didn't get up, so I didn't have to increase my shutter speed there. But just thinking wisely about what shutter speed you need relative to what you're photographing, in my opinion, that is the most important thing to remember or to get right when you are shooting in low light. One thing I also try and do when my shutter speed is getting a lot slower, like at 1/15th of a second, is I take multiple frames. What that does, it just increases your chances of getting a sharp shot. I think in this example, maybe I took 20 or 30 frames at 1/15th of a second. Again, that just helps you increase your chances of nailing a sharp photograph. I normally take maybe a second burst, take the finger off the shutter, refocus the lens, take another few frames, because what that also does, if you don't perfectly focus on your subject, rather take your finger off after a burst of shots, refocus, take another few images, your chances of getting a sharp shot will increase dramatically. Let's have a look at this next image of an elephant close up here. This was shot at 26 millimeters, so the elephant was incredibly close. And also, the elephant was very close to the source of light here, so I didn't have to go extremely high with the ISO. Obviously, the closer the animal is to the light, the brighter it will be. The more further away the light is from the subject, the dimmer the light will be. So in this example, the elephant was very, very bright. Now, there's one thing to remember when you are shooting in low light like this. When you look through your viewfinder, especially if it's a mirrorless camera, the image will always appear a little bit brighter than what it is. That viewfinder will display the image quite bright. So just remember that, and remember, judge your exposure on the histogram inside that EVF. Don't judge it on what you actually see. You'll be surprised in low light, your image will appear bright, but your histogram will be a lot towards the left-hand side. So just keep that in mind. In this example here, the elephant was just drinking. As he lifted his head, he was basically dead still. And because I was using a 24-70 f2.8, I shot at f2.8. My ISO was not incredibly high because I was shooting at f2.8, the light was close to the subject, and I chose a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. I also liked the slight blur in the water droplets here. I didn't want them to be too streaked with a slow shutter speed, and I didn't want them to be too sharp with a fast shutter speed. So I went for 1/200th of a second, and for this scene, I was incredibly happy with the results. Now, in low light, often you struggle with autofocus. It can be very tricky for a camera to focus correctly when the light is incredibly low. If you are using a wider aperture lens, it does give your camera a little bit more of an advantage to focus. But if you're focusing with something like a 180-600 at f6.3, it can give the camera a bit of a hard time when the light is incredibly low. So this is what I do. I set my camera to auto area AF with subject detection. I let the camera try and pick up the subject. If it's not working or if it's hunting too much, I'll then switch to single point autofocus and manually just move that point on the main part of the subject and just use it like that. The reality is, low light will always introduce noise, no matter how carefully you shoot. Your goal in the field is to capture the sharpest possible image, then deal with the noise afterwards. If you want to see exactly how I process these noisy, low-light files and recover details safely, watch this editing tutorial next.